Our speaker tonight is a lawyer, a real estate developer, an historian, and an author. Jim Stolpestad is the author of Great Northern Iron, which is his third book. His second book, Custom House, Restoring a St. Paul Landmark in Lowertown, received local and national book awards. Jim has a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors in history and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Minnesota, and has been recognized as an alumni of notable achievement. He was a federal agency lawyer, a Minnesota Special Assistant Attorney General, and practicing lawyer in the Twin Cities during the 1970s and the 1980s before starting Exeter Business, which is a leading Twin City commercial real estate developer now in its 30th year. Jim has family connections to the subject matter of Great Northern Iron. His granduncle worked for Lewis W. Hill at Northwestern Trust Company and the First National Bank of St. Paul from 1916 to 1936. And the First National Bank of his wife's father and grandfather had positions with Hannah Mining on the Cuyuna Range in the 1930s and the 1940s. And his first cousin's family owned the productive Hunter Mine on the Mesabi Range in the 1950s. Autographed copies of the Northern Iron will be on sale following the presentation tonight at the table just in the foyer out there. They are autographed, and if you want a special autograph tailored to your desires, Jim will be happy to do that. Please give a warm welcome to Jim Stolpestad.
We can blame Joe Mikloff on all of this. Joe and I ran into each other at an event in November of 17. And Joe had just wrapped up the Great Northern Iron Ore Properties Trust, along with Roger Johnson over here and Tom Janikowski and Joe Stein. We've got most of the people right here. Joe wanted to create a historical record of this significant 109-year trust. And he was looking for some help. And I volunteered. So Lou Hill stepped forward with some financial assistance. Lou was over there, many of you know Lou. Dick Nicholson, a St. Paul historian, did the same. And I discovered that Corrine Eklund, an old law partner from years ago, had represented the trust for like 30 years. Where are you? There you are. So we had a good nucleus of people to help. Off we went. But first of all, I had to get, I think, the blessing of Roger and Tom. And so we had like 3 lunch meetings at the Town and Country Club, and finally, it seemed that I was okay. So we had this great group assembled, and I think I'd like to publicly thank them tonight. And let's give them a little round of applause. It all started here at North Oaks in 1883, when James J. Hill bought the old Charles Gilfillan farm, only 3,000 acres in those days. And it was pretty empty. There weren't as many trees at that time as there are now. But Hill established his summer home here, as you know, and his working farm. And as you already just heard earlier, Three Bold Ventures, the book, wonderful book, traces the history of North Oaks. But now we have to shift gears to head up north to the Iron Range. In 1893, Louis Hill came home from college. He was graduated from Yale University, and he was promptly sent up north by his father. His father didn't mess around. He said, "Get up there." So Louis was a very reliable and studious guy. He went up there. He wanted to learn the iron ore business. Iron ore had been discovered on the range 3 years earlier in 1890. The Merritt family was behind that, and they made Duluth a boom town. 70,000 people were living in Duluth at the time. I'm not even sure if there's that many today. Duluth was the head of Lake Superior Shipping and the eastern terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad. But unfortunately, 1893 was also the beginning of a 4-year depression. The Panic of 1893, it was called. As a result, some 15,000 businesses around the country went bankrupt, including the Merritts, unfortunately. And that left many choice parcels of land available for savvy investors with deep pockets, people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and of course the Hills. So there's a quote here that I really like, and from Louis Hill, who looks back upon his years up there. He said, "I went to Duluth in 1893 and lived in the Spalding Hotel there for 3 years. During that period, I secured for the railroad the bulk of the properties which became the Great Northern Iron Ore Trust." Here's a picture of the Lake Superior Iron Ore region. Obviously, there's Lake Superior, but south of that is Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and you see a lot of red lines on that map. Those are iron ranges. You probably didn't realize there were that many. The most important, of course, is the Mesabi Range in the middle of Minnesota, 110 miles long. Right in the middle is the city of Hibbing. In 1899, the Hills set up a subsidiary of the railroad called Lake Superior Company Limited. It was set up to buy ore lands. The first purchase included the rail lines, the ore docks, and 10,000 acres of iron ore land from the defunct Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad. Next came the 25,000 acres from the Wright and Davis timbermen, and that included the Hull Rest Mahoning mine near Hibbing. I can show you a picture of that in a minute. James J. Hill's biographer referred to that deal as, quote, one of the bargains of the century. The third big acquisition was the Merritt's North Star Iron. Altogether, by 1906, they'd assembled 67,000 acres of the Mesabi Range. These transactions were facilitated by surveyor Edmund Longyear, who used the newly invented diamond drill to explore for iron ore, and he and his crew over a 20-year period drilled something like 7,000 test pits. And this map here, not the greatest map, but the red areas of the map show where he did all the drilling. But he actually defined the contours of the Mesabi Iron Range. I mentioned the Hull Rest Mahoning mine. This is near Hibbing. Many of you have probably been up there and have seen the current status of this mine, but this is probably early 1900s. enormous mine. It's the biggest iron ore mine in the world at the time. And now if you go up there, it's much bigger. I don't know, twice as big, 10 times bigger, something like that. So by 1906, Lake Superior Company was cruising along with 67,000 acres, and a problem developed in Congress. The Congress is about to pass something called the Hepburn Act, which would prohibit a railroad from owning iron ore land. Bit of a problem. So what to do? The ever creative Hill Brain Trust came up with the idea of establishing Great Northern Iron Ore Properties Trust. So Lake Superior Company deeded all the land, not to the trust, but to 4 trustees, 4 individuals in their capacity as trustees. So in this manner, they legally bypassed the Hepburn Act. So over the next 109 years, the trustees would own the land and lease it. After 1915, they leased it to numerous iron and steel companies for actual mining purposes. The trust never mined anything. They leased all the land to third parties who did the tough work of mining. So by the 1940s, there were 16 different companies doing the mining from 400 different mines. Now this vast output of iron ore furnished enough steel for the United States to win World War II. So Minnesota's Iron Range was vital in that whole process. I mentioned there are 4 trustees. Here are the initial 4. Louis Sr., his brother Jimmy, they called him Jimmy. Walter is only 21. And the railroad executive, Ed Nichols. The senior Hill was never part of the trust. He was never an officer or a trustee. Here's a diagram showing the trust. It's pretty complicated. Probably the only person who understands it would be Bob Stein over here. But just one thing worth mentioning, the box on the left that says 18 men and boys measuring lives. So that determined the duration of the trust, how long it would last. We'll come back to that a little later. At the time that the trust was created in 1906, there were 1.5 million railroad shares outstanding. So they decided to issue 1.5 million trust shares and give them to the railroad shareholders on a one-to-one basis free. Now, I should point out that later buyers had to pay for them, but the initial shareholders got them free. At the end of that year, early '07, they registered the shares on the New York Stock Exchange. And the trust was the first Minnesota business to be registered on the New York Stock Exchange. It had a valuation at that time of $127 million, which would be about $420 million in today's dollars. Of all the there were a lot of shareholders, but of the largest shareholders, J.M.J. Hill was the only one from Minnesota. All the other ones were either from the East or from Europe. Now at home I had the list of all the shareholders, but it's way too long to go into this. So if you were a Great Northern Railroad shareholder, you got a certificate like this, whether you had 1 share, 100 shares, whatever it was. Now that you're also a trust shareholder, you get one like this. So you have 2 stock certificates to keep track of. Moving ahead in time, 10 years to 1916, James J. Hill unexpectedly passed away at the age of 77. He was at home the morning of May 29th and had been attended to by doctors Will and Charlie Mayo, who had left their clinic in Rochester for the first time ever to come up to St. Paul to try to save James J. Hill, and they unfortunately were not successful. He passed away. His demise was covered by the New York Times, all the local papers. The governor of Minnesota ordered all the state flags reduced to half staff. And at 2 o'clock on the day of the funeral, all the Hill railroads, and there were dozens and dozens of them, stopped for 5 minutes in honor of the empire builder. It was later discovered that neither Mr. Hill nor his wife, Mary, who was in frail health and died 6 years later in 1921, had signed their wills. So they died intestate, governed by the Minnesota laws of intestate succession, which meant that the 9 adult children each got an equal share of the huge Hill estate. I can just imagine that. The children at one time were close, but they weren't anymore. So it set off a decade-long sibling dispute. Actually, my granduncle was right in the middle of that as an advisor and so forth. The trust continued for another 101 years, and it had 17 trustees altogether over that time period. And I've highlighted in yellow some of the most important ones and familiar to you. Joe Micheloff, Bob Stein, both long-termers, along with Louis Hill Sr. and Jr. Some of those other names may be familiar to you as well. And then the trust had the officers. There were 5 presidents of the trust. Joe Micheloff he was the last one. He served for 18 years in that capacity. And you've already met Tom and Roger, 28 and 32 years respectively, in their very responsible jobs. It was a very competent team that handled the trust in its last years. In 1931, the trust built this building in Hibbing. It's ironic that was the worst year of the trust, because that was the Depression. I think they had no income that year, but yet they built a brand new building. It's still there, still functioning as the operating entity for the trust. The executive office was in St. Paul, where the railroad was based. It occupied 3 different locations in St. Paul from left to right here. The building on the left is the original Great Northern Building, built in 1888. The middle building is the Railroad and Bank Building, built in 1916. At 1 million square feet of office space. It was the biggest office space in Minnesota until the IDS Center in 1973. And then the iconic First National Bank Building. So all these buildings were built with Hill money. Moving ahead in time to 1970, natural ore was pretty much exhausted, probably by the 1950s. And it left behind huge pit lakes like this one. This one is near Virginia, Minnesota. But just imagine that expanse being filled up with iron ore and being hauled out over a period of 50, 80 years. It's amazing. I'm sure many of you have been up to the Iron Range. It's just dotted with pit lakes. Fortunately, taconite began to replace natural ore thanks to the research and advocacy of this man, Edward Davis of the U of M School of Mines. He had a building constructed on the U of M Minneapolis campus, which is still there. It's used for something different now, but that's where all the initial research on taconite was done. And then there were two changes in state tax law that greatly boosted the fortunes of taconite. In 1941, real estate tax assessments on the range changed to the value of the ore actually extracted rather than some vague estimate. 1964, a state constitutional amendment was passed that limited income tax rates on taconite for 25 years to a level similar to other manufacturing products in the state. As a result, in the 1950s, two new taconite plants were built, and then 6 more in later years. So taconite was very much on the way. The first 2 plants were these: reserve mining and Erie mining. I'm sure many of you remember the controversy over reserve mining's dumping of tailings in Lake Superior, which was finally put a stop to. It's now called North Shore. It's run by Cleveland Cliffs. Erie mining near Babbitt has been idle since 2001. In other words, nothing's happening there. Now, there's been talk about a copper nickel mine there, but so far it's just been talk. Taconite is a dirty, noisy business. A lot of digging, blasting, and hauling goes on. The taconite rock is dumped in one of these enormous trucks, hauled away to one of these taconite plants where it's processed. Starts out as rocks, ends up as powder. And the powder is mixed with clay to create pellets. There's a great quote here from another historian's work. Within the noisy, dusty plants where taconite is finely crushed, formed into pellets and baked, automation reigns. The lines of huge machines have an eerie appearance. They move all day, every day, without human guidance. Usually workers are not to be seen. Automation includes robotic devices and automatic loading and unloading of rail cars used to export pellets. Kind of weird. Moving ahead in time again to 1995, a turning point has been reached for the trust because Louis Hill Jr. died at the age of 92. He was the last of the 18 measuring lives. So when the trust was formed, Louis Hill Jr. was 3 years old. The average age of the 18 measuring lives at the outset of the trust was 16, I think. And it was projected that the trust would last 66 years based on life expectancy tables, which would have had it ending in 1972. Well, obviously it lasted a lot longer than that. Here are the last 4 trustees that wound up the trust. Messrs. Mikhailoff, Stein, Staley, and Swearingen. I'm sure that Joe and Bob remember those days very well. So it's fair to ask, how did the trust perform by the numbers? And I guess the answer is pretty well. It shipped 750 million tons of iron ore and taconite from the 375 mines over that 109 years. It paid out almost $600 million to its investors in cash. Now, adjusted for inflation, that's almost $3 billion today. And remember, the original shareholders got their shares free. As the last of the 9 holders of the trust's reversionary interest, ConocoPhillips received $150 million when it sold the interest in 2016 to former Minnesota Vikings owner Red McCombs, of all people, who passed away last year at the age of 95. So we end with a recap of some key points here. 1893, young Louis Hill moved to Duluth to learn the iron ore business. 1899, he bought the first lands for the Great Northern Railroad subsidiary. 1906, the Hepburn Act forced a readjustment and the creation of the trust. 1950, or thereabouts, the decade of the 1950s, iron ore was exhausted by World War II and replaced by taconite. And then 1995, Louis Hill's son, Louis Jr., was the trust's last measuring life, and he died on April 6th, 1995. By the way, the book was published on April 6, 2020, starting a 20-year wind-up period. The last activity that the trust had took place on June 9th of 2017, when this gentleman here, Tom Janikowski, wired some funds to various accounts. This slide shows book credits, who did what for the book. You can read that at your leisure. That kind of ends the talk.